Hi, friends. I had an entirely different kind of episode planned for the first 2025 episode of No Wrong Notes, but a lot has happened in the past 2 weeks, and I wanted to share something different. I want to share a message for those of you who might be struggling right now, and if and how singing has a place in the midst of your struggling and grief. Life isn't just sunshine and rainbows, as we all know, and I sometimes feel that the singing community can be a little passive when real struggle is happening in the world. Sure, we can post to our stories about hashtag pray for California when wildfires break out, and we can call it a day. But oftentimes I feel like not enough voice teachers and singers hold real space for grief. Instead of pausing and taking time for singers to process what is really happening in the world, what I often see is a return to business as usual. Instead of that sacred pause to feel and process emotions, I see let's get back to singing. I myself am guilty of this at times, so I'm not just calling out other voice teachers and singers, but am acknowledging that I do it too. We are not perfect, and there really isn't a perfect way to grieve the things that are happening in the world, whether it's climate-related grief in the form of wildfires, collective trauma in the form of running out of water here in Richmond last week, or personal trauma in the form of losing a loved one. But we have a responsibility as teachers and singers to hold space for that grief. Beyond that, we have a responsibility as individuals to care for each other beyond reposting to Instagram stories. Reposting simply isn't enough anymore, and we aren't just singers, but singers living in a changing world. So how do we hold space for grief as singers and teachers, and what does it look like to care for each other both in a voice lesson setting and outside of that in our communities? Well, it looks different for everyone, of course, but I'll share an example from my own experience where a voice teacher provided space for me to process my grief. Back at Texas State, when I was getting my bachelor's degree, I was involved in the co-ed fraternity Mu Phi Epsilon. During my last year at Texas State, one of my brothers died. It affected my fraternity immensely, and we were all grieving. Outside of Mu Phi, many other students in the School of Music were grieving as well. When I showed up for my voice lesson that week, I was very depressed. I didn't really feel like singing, and instead of jumping right into warm-ups, my teacher asked me if I wanted to talk about what happened or if I needed time to cry and grieve. I did, and it meant so much to me that he provided that space for me to grieve rather than proceeding in a manner of business as usual. Like I said, grieving looks different for everyone, and some people may find it easier to just sing through their grief. But each singer deserves to have a chance to decide what that process looks like for them. Even though I just shared a story of personal grief, this process applies to world events too. A lot has happened in the past 8 or 9 years. We had a pandemic, climate-related events get more frequent, not to mention the many mass shootings we've had in that time frame. These events will keep happening unless major structural change happens, like a major change to our way of life, which means we will need to be resilient. And for those of us that feel called to do so, fight for that change. But we can't be resilient unless we grieve. So where does singing fit into that equation? How can we even justify sharing our voices in creative ways when there's so much going on in the wider world? I'll be honest and say that I feel this way sometimes. It's hard to make music when I don't have clean water to drink or something traumatic is happening in my family. So I won't say that singing will heal your problems. What I will say is that singing will be there for you when you need a place to channel your grief. Singing and using our voices to express ourselves and express how we're feeling is one of my favorite ways to process what I am feeling. Like I said earlier, it's not the only way to process grief. Sometimes you really need a therapist or a crying session. But when you need it, it's there for you. I will say this too. Don't self-correct when expressing what you feel through song, if you're just using singing as this way to express what you're feeling. As singers, we can be real perfectionists, and perfectionism doesn't have a place when you're trying to let your emotions pass through you. So when you're ready, put on a song that you love that reflects how you feel and let your voice go. Let it express what your tears cannot. Let it be a release of what you feel. Singing can have a place in the grieving process if that method of expression speaks to you. But we aren't just singers, we are individuals living in community with others. As big and uncertain as our world may feel right now, and this is not to invalidate that, life has always been uncertain. What has changed is how we take care of each other. Our technology is keeping us from connecting with people IRL. This isn't to demonize technology either. Technological advances within the last 20 years have made it possible for us to connect with people all around the world. It's even allowed me to connect with teachers on this podcast that live in different places. But for those of us with the means and ability to do so, it isn't enough for us to just show up for the causes that we care about only in online spaces. You don't have to attend a protest to make a difference either. Even small things like checking on your neighbors count. You'd be surprised at how many people live around you that aren't on social media and have no idea what kinds of resources might be available to them in a crisis. When our water went out in Richmond last week, I went and checked in on our elderly neighbor, and they had no idea where to pick up bottled water or that we were supposed to be boiling water when it came back on. Like I said, helping each other beyond online spaces doesn't have to be a big production. Sometimes it's something small like getting to know your neighbors or giving money or resources like canned goods to a mutual aid group. I understand that some of you might be listening to this and thinking to yourself, but isn't this a singing podcast? While it may be a singing podcast, I'm kind of done boxing myself in this podcast into one neat little box. We do ourselves a disservice by thinking in binaries, as in you're either a singer or an activist, but you can't be both online because you have to be marketable. I'm not just one thing, and you aren't either. We all contain multitudes, and we have to honor those multitudes. And while I may not be perfect and this episode may not be perfect, I hope that it affirms some of you singers who may be struggling right now. I hope that it inspires some, at least those with the ability and resources to do so, to go beyond our singing spaces and share our voices with those in our local communities. Working on your singing isn't just for the betterment of your own voice, but to gain the confidence to share your voice as a catalyst for change in the world. So as a final message to you, I hope you're able to process your grief this year in ways that make sense for you, that you're able to use singing as a tool to express what can't be cried out, and that you're then able to use your voice in service to others. Happy singing, y'all.